Hi, I'm Alyssa Rosenberg, the culture blogger at Think Progress and a column at The Atlantic and Slate. And I'm here today with the fabulous Todd VanDerWerff from the AV Club.
Hello.
Welcome. I know this is your first time on Blogging Heads, so we are super glad to have you. I wanted to start out by talking a little bit about a weird event that you and I just spent 2 weeks sort of locked in a conference room doing, and that is the Television Critics Association press tour. I was wondering if you wanted to provide a little context on that crazed event for our listeners who may have never heard of this strange ritual before.
The Television Critics Association press tour is 2 weeks in January and 2 weeks in July/August when the various networks gather the television critics and journalists of the nation and put them in a hotel ballroom and put their new programs in front of us and try to convince us that they're going to be great. And we sort of try to trip them up and make news. And it's a nice place to get interviews and to talk to people and to gain access, I guess. But it's also a very strange... it feels like it's left over from like the 1950s or something, even though it started in the 70s. It feels like it's sort of like the TV critics equivalent of the Kiwanis Club. I don't know. It's a very weird thing, and I always like to say that it's like the most useless thing I do all year, but also absolutely vital to doing my job.
Well, and you wrote a piece about TCA for the AV Club recently, and you sort of laid out some of the reasons that it's both useless and useful. And you've been my guide to TCA the last 2 times that I've gone. And so I was wondering if you could flesh that out a little bit for us. Because obviously we spend a lot of time sitting in this room listening to people talk, sometimes about programming that sounds excellent, sometimes about programming that sounds very good, all of which will sort of evolve over time. Like, we're seeing the first versions of these things. We don't have that much information about the programming. It's a little bit of it's kind of a catch-as-catch event, I think.
Yeah, it's such a weird thing because they bring us all into this weird environment where they're trying to sort of manage the expectations, I guess. But it's not a Comic-Con type situation where everybody in that room is predisposed to love them, and that's a little weird. Like, a lot of the times the casts for the new shows will come out and expect us to applaud them, and it's not done because it's a room full of journalists, and it's a very weird little sort of insular place. Where, I never quite know how to explain it to people because it is just literally like sitting in a hotel ballroom and listening to people talk for 10 hours a day. And I realize that doesn't sound, compared to like digging ditches, that's nothing. But it can be sort of taxing to sort of, at some point you get done trying to cut through all the bullshit and you're just like, sure, Finding Bigfoot is the best show on television.
Well, one thing I think I've told you that I find interesting about TCA is that, unlike political journalism, where it can be, difficult to get unscripted moments with the candidates or with government officials, TCA is sort of fascinating in that the networks just throw all of these people up on stage, and there are no pre-approved questions. There are sort of microphones that get passed around. People are prepared to a certain extent, although they can't predict everything. And you can really just ask anything you want, as we've seen from some of our colleagues. And so there's a sense in which, the level of access is sort of fascinating and unscripted. But you also have people who are very good at sort of spinning narratives for a living who, are in some cases just kind of either... really spinning, as I think Paul Lee at ABC is kind of want to do.
Yeah.
Either he just really likes screwing with us, or he really, really is excited about The Neighbors, his sitcom, where there are aliens who move into a suburban neighborhood, or sort of in as Aaron Sorkin did with his session for the newsroom, are very, very confident in versions of the truth that other people just don't agree with or see at all.
Sure,
It's a weird combination of sort of confrontation and sort of trying to find the right word for it. It's a weird mixture of tones, I think, in some ways.
At the same time, I think there are limits to how valuable some of that can be. For example, when Paul Lee from ABC was there, he was there right at the height of when the Modern Family contract dispute was going on. And there was literally nothing he could say about it. Yet we were obligated to just sort of keep asking him because, he couldn't say anything about the contract negotiations, and he had his little spiel down about how he was positive everything was going to work out. And, it was probably 5 to 10 minutes we spent trying to get him to say something other than, I'm positive this is going to work out, and him just saying, I'm positive this is going to work out. So there are limits to, the amount of access you get, the ability you're able to crack through the facade of the network messaging. But yeah, I do think, especially, for networks like NBC, they're often very upfront about their struggles, and that's an interesting thing to see. And having covered a few other industries, it's very unusual. I think the only, and this isn't even really the same thing, the only thing that really compares is the video game industry has E3, and that is much more stage managed than TCA is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that TCA also gets at some of the things that are more interesting about covering television. And, in the time that both of us have been writing about television professionally, has sort of coincided with the time when people who watch the shows have become, at least some of them, have become much more sort of familiar with and interested in how their television is made. Mm-hmm. And, I wonder if that sort of, when you're going into TCA, I know I have my priorities. How does that sort of fit in? How does that sort of affect your coverage plans, I guess? I mean, what's most interesting to you? Because I think one of the challenges is that we're both primarily critics. We write about the text of the shows, sort of as they're seen, but we're going into this event where we've seen at most maybe an hour or a half hour of this programming. Mm-hmm. So we're both critics who sort of go into this thing and have to switch into sort of reporter mode.
Yeah, it's weird because TV criticism is one of the only forms of criticism where somebody steps in and says, you're not just saying, I enjoyed this pilot, you're saying, I think there's a good chance you'll enjoy this, a year from now. And that's not always the case. You get that wrong sometimes. But TCA is very invaluable in seeing the people sit up on stage and seeing their rapport in the cast and seeing if the writers have any idea how to answer the most basic questions about their shows. Because most of these sessions are about a half hour long, so you don't get to really get in depth with the creators, but you can usually tell if they have a handle on what they're doing or if they're just sort of making it all up as they go along. And I find that invaluable as a critic. I mean, it's caused me to make some bad calls before, but it's also caused me to make some very good calls, to look at shows I wouldn't have looked at a little more closely.
I definitely agree with you that I think is one of the unique, as someone who writes a lot about movies and books and a little bit about music, we really are both asking our readers to make sort of much longer gambles or going along on sort of longer rides. And so, I mean, I think that, both of us are people who spend a lot of time in our comment sections, and, I feel a certain obligation when I tell my readers to check something out or to stick with something if I've seen more episodes of it than they have, or having seen more episodes of something than they have, then I warn them away. Mm-hmm. And I think among critics, it's an interesting and much more interactive relationship with our readers, particularly given the rise of sort of episode-by-episode recaps, which is something that you do much better than I do, in terms of sort of fostering those long-term discussions as the shows spiral out.
Sure. It's a weird, it's a weird science, and it doesn't always work out. But I do think that there is some value to sitting there and watching these people sort of, if they hem and haw their way through really basic answers, you can know that they don't quite know what they're doing. And if they have really, a show that I sort of had my doubts about on ABC is called Last Resort, because I'm not sure what the show is there, but the panel at TCA they had answers to all the questions people would ask. And obviously, it still could turn out to be a bad show. It still could be a show where the pilot is fun, but then everything after, they don't know what they're doing. But at TCA, I really did feel like they sort of know where they're going with all of this. And, not necessarily that I'm in good hands or anything like that, but I know that somebody there has some idea where they're going with this. And that's always nice to know on television, where that's sort of the difference between a potentially good show and a potentially cataclysmic one.
I would say I feel the same way about Lost Resort, which is the S.H.I.E.L.D. creator Sean Ryan's show about the crew of a nuclear submarine who is ordered to fire on Pakistan, says they won't, runs off to a tropical island, which they sort of take over and declare an independent nation. Which seemed to me like a great movie, but not necessarily like a 22-episode show. And I wanted to ask sort of what other shows either rose or fell in your estimation at TCA? We're coming up on the time when our readers are going to have a lot of new options to choose from, and I was curious sort of who made the best impression or who gave you cause for concern.
I didn't have the thing that sometimes happens where you like a show and then the panel for it at TCA is so weird that you wonder why you like the show. I had a number of shows that I kind of liked the pilots for that I feel more enthusiastic about recommending because of the TCA panels. Specifically, I'm thinking of ABC's drama Nashville, which I wasn't sure if it knew what it was doing. It was all over the place, and it was sort of trying to do this gigantic city-spanning story, but also tell a really soapy, goofy kind of story about the country music business. But the panel for that sort of convinced me that is a show that has its head on its shoulders. I don't know if it's going to live up to its potential, but I know that it knows it has potential to live up to, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there have been a lot of shows where they have a lot of potential, but it seems like everybody involved has no particular regard to live up to that. Another one that I really was impressed by the panel for was Fox's new comedy Ben and Kate. I already liked the pilot quite a bit, but I wasn't sure what the show was, and the panel sort of convinced me that the show really can be just the sort of wacky exploits about this brother and sister and their various friends. And another one that I felt like they answered a lot of questions I had was CBS's new drama Vegas, which I was worried was just going to be like CSI in the 1960s, but instead it sounds like they're going for more of a cable-y, Good Wife style type tone, and that's encouraging to hear.
One thing I wanted to talk about a little bit was Nashville and Vegas, both of which feel like they're network shows with awfully big palettes, and we've come to sort of expect that we'll see those kinds of shows on cable in part because of The Wire, which through its 5 seasons kind of takes a look at all of these different institutions in Baltimore. But it's interesting to me to see that kind of approach creep into network. I mean, one of the things that got me really excited about Nashville, which follows Connie Britton and Hayden Panettiere as an older and a younger country singer who are sort of forced to tour together and are immediately hilariously nastily at odds, was that it's also this show about, political elections and economic development in Nashville. I mean, I was sort of surprised to see creators at a network panel talk about, the rise of the next great American city. That's sort of a wonky, almost urban planning type thing. And the creators of Vegas were also talking about, water rights and the environment. Those seem like big shows for the respective networks and sort of big ideas.
Well, all of it's, ratings dependent. It'll really depend on, if Vegas and Nashville are hits, they'll probably get to try some of this stuff. But if they're struggling to gain that audience, then they'll inevitably turn into the lowest common denominator version of themselves. And there are elements I like of both shows, even if they're the lowest common denominator version of themselves. But, it's just one of those situations where it's kind of a wait-and-see approach. I remember, this is not a show I saw a TCA panel for, but the guy who created Brothers and Sisters, I don't remember his name. I think it was John Robin Bates. He had this dream for the show being about, the whole of this community where the show was set, and they were going to do stuff about the migrant workers, and they were going to do, this elaborate family stories, and of course, Brothers and Sisters was absolutely none of that, and I don't think ever could have possibly been. So I think in a lot of cases, these people talk a big game, and you have to hope they can back it up. And in that case, it's sort of valuable to have seen the pilot and have seen the panel and hope that the truth is somewhere in between them.
That's an interesting question. I mean, do you judge shows by the standards that their creators set for them? I mean, I know I have a tendency to do that. If someone tries to get me to watch a show by saying that, it's going to be like feminist or societally important, as I did with John Landgraf and FX and Charlie Sheen's show Anger Management, I tend to sort of feel like I am allowed to hold them to that. And I don't know if you feel the same way about creators, especially given that, I guess it's sort of different if a creator tells you something than if a network president tells you something, since creators can come under pressure.
Sure. Yeah, obviously you want to get somebody who goes close to the source as possible. I feel like the anger management thing was different because that was a very calculated play by FX to bring in, this audience that I guess they already had, because they made a lot of money off of 2.5 Men reruns. But this was a very calculated play to bring in this larger audience, and it's really paid off for them. I mean, that show has huge ratings, and really sort of depressingly huge ratings. But it's very much. I don't know. I think that in that case, it was definitely a question for the network head. But yeah, in most cases, I feel like TCA is the one chance to really sort of zero in on the people who are actually making the show work.
Yeah. I was also curious. I think you and I both had a couple of shows where the panels left us less excited than we'd been for shows too. And if I'm correct, I think the Mindy Project was one of those for both of us, right?
I didn't like the pilot a whole lot. I was hoping that the panel would say, yeah, we know the pilot was overstuffed, there's way too much going on in it, but we have a plan going forward, and I didn't get that sense. Which is too bad. I like a lot of the people involved in the project, but the pilot is muddled, and the panel was also muddled. It's a very strange situation, and it's weird because it's hugely hyped, and it's been sort of held up sight unseen as like the next big quality comedy, and I don't know where it got that reputation necessarily. I think because Mindy Kaling wrote it, and she's a very funny woman.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting show. It came out of the NBC Diversity Writers Program, and then NBC sold it to Fox, which to me, that show has been kind of it's been interesting to see how it's been treated in trade news as well as in sort of critically, because there's some sense that, or there have been some reports that suggest it was Fox being smarter than NBC, although I thought NBC, the executives, when they were talking about it, were talking about the need to sort of sell good shows that can provide a financial base for NBC to develop good stuff as well. So I think it's a show that's been overhyped both because people like Mindy Kaling and want her to succeed, but also because it has these sort of, these business implications too. It's become a show of sort of, I don't want to say outsized importance, because it would be really awesome to have a young woman of color succeed as a showrunner or as a show creator, but it definitely seems like it's had expectations attached to it that don't really have anything to do with the text of the show itself.
Yeah, and it's probably a situation where some of those expectations are too high to begin with. But that's always a problem with comedy, is that people, get very high expectations for the pilot, and they watch the pilot, and comedy pilots are rarely very good. The best you can hope for with a comedy pilot is to hit about a B or a B+, and then hope for the best from there. So it's just such a tricky thing, because so many people will tune into a comedy pilot and say, well, that wasn't very funny, I'm never coming back. And it just is it's a weird situation, and I feel always so strange about reviewing comedies based on just having seen the pilot, because there's so much potential there to write off a show that eventually becomes really funny, or to overpraise a show that doesn't have anything left in its tank after a funny pilot.
Yeah. I mean, I think both of us just sort of maybe felt that way about Two Broke Girls, CBS's recession show, that I think both of us really wanted to succeed, and then were dismayed when it went down the black hole of racism and idiocy.
Don't bring up Two Broke Girls ever. Don't do
I'm
that.
sorry,
No.
I won't.
No,
I will not.
No, another one that I often think of is, and this is like, I really liked the first season of this show, but I feel like Modern Family had such a good pilot, it could never live up to it. But, you know, that's a show where I really liked the first season, and I feel like the second season had some strong episodes, and the third season was kind of a mess. But, you know, it's a thing where a really good comedy pilot is hard to live up to. What you want is some room to go up.
Yeah.
But a lot of the time when there's room to go up, you know, that's when people start tuning out. I always think about, like, the fact that Cougar Town actually debuted with a higher rating in the key demo, which is such a TV. I hate myself every time I say key demo.
It's okay, I forgive you.
Yeah, it debuted with a higher rating in the key demo than Modern Family. And, you know, then it very sort of steadily fell off because it was a show that took a while to find itself. But I'm much more passionate about that show than I am about Modern Family now. And, you know, I just feel like comedy takes time, but time is the last thing that people want to give television a lot of the time. And I understand why. You know, you're giving over so much of your life to something that could potentially, you know, suck.
Yeah. I mean, there seems to me, you know, just, I think, writing about this full time for kind of a year and a half, to be a real divide in the way that people view comedy in particular. There are, you know, sort of a couple of big, broad comedies that work for a lot of people. Modern Family, The Show That Shall Not Be Named, 2.5 Men. And then there are comedies that work for just a very small, dedicated number of people. And I can't imagine what it would be like to be trying to make a comedy under those circumstances. Do you go super broad and have Modern Families like ladies be on their period and things be nuts jokes? Do you go really smart and hope that, you know, the sort of 5 million people that seems to be the number that you need to sort of keep a show alive on NBC for something like Parks and Recreation shows up? I mean, I can't even imagine what it's like to try and calibrate what you're trying to do in that environment.
Bill Lawrence, speaking of Cougar Town, the guy who created Cougar Town and Scrubs and Spin City, Bill Lawrence has said that he thinks, you know, the job of a showrunner now is to find your audience and then just deliver to them so consistently that they keep coming back. And then, you know, your network will figure out a way to monetize that audience. And I think in comedy that's true. I don't know if it's true in drama just yet. The only example I can think of in drama, at least on the broadcast networks, is probably The Good Wife, which CBS is monetizing pretty much just because rich people watch it. But, you know, in comedy you can do that because comedy's a little less expensive. You could probably do it in reality too, but I don't know that reality inspires that kind of passion in people outside of the really big hit reality shows. But yeah, I think part of the problem, and Jamie Weinman, a really brilliant TV blogger, has talked about this a lot. Part of the problem is that we don't have a mass culture anymore, so we don't have common points to make jokes about within the culture. So pretty much all that's left is sex. And CBS, which has by far the most successful comedies on television, does, you know, sex joke after sex joke after sex joke after sex joke. And I honestly, you know, that's a situation where those shows are so popular, I think, because they are making jokes about one of the few things that everybody still sort of has a connection to in their lives.
Yeah, no, I can definitely see that. And it's funny looking at this fall's comedies, sort of what people are trying to identify as, you know, potential common ground. NBC has, you know, Go On, which has as its common ground sort of grief or mourning, which it's interpreting broadly. As Guys with Kids, where it's like, oh, men with babies, that is hilarious. Mm-hmm. And then it has Animal Practice, which seems to have as its sort of big general thing, a monkey on a tiny ambulance.
Yeah, you know? Yeah. No, NBC is sort of following this weird composite strategy of where they're going to get as many like 90s sitcom stars on their network as they can, right down to Guys with Kids, which is just crammed. It's like Meadow Sopranos in there, and Vanessa from the Cosby Show. It's a really weird cast that one has. But, you know, they're just...
It also has Jesse Bradford for those of us who were teenage nerd girls and love him very dearly.
Yeah, yeah. I was surprised at surprised at the love for Jesse Bradford, but I haven't seen Bring It On in a few years, so that may be it.
Or he's also like kind of greasy and hilarious in Hackers, but that is probably best left in the recesses of my brain.
I will take your word for that.
Fair.
No, but yeah, NBC's strategy seems to be we're going to put on a bunch of 90s sitcom stars, and then we're going to put them in what we think are broad shows, but I don't know that they are really broad shows. Like Go On, I look at that show and I find elements to admire in it, but I don't see what the audience for that show is. You know, you watch Modern Family. When it's good, when it's bad, when it's mediocre, you know exactly what the audience for that show is. You know exactly what the audience is for The Big Bang Theory. I don't know who NBC is thinking is going to sit down and watch Go On. You know, like I don't know who that's pitched at, and that's a hard thing to do in this sort of nichified world.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always open to new things, but I would not have said that there's a yawning hole for a show about a grief counseling group in my life. You know, I feel like in a way NBC seems like it could be doing a little bit better with its dramas, since its idea of broad when it comes to dramas is hot firefighters so far, which I think that's a pretty broadly appealing idea, especially when it's
hot firefighters and like the world ends in a really improbable fashion.
Yeah, I mean the apocalypse is pretty popular if you look at contemporary American popular culture. So
I think they
seem to be doing.
I think they're going to have some success with Revolution. You know, I don't like it that much. I think the pilot's kind of a mess, but it's a canny combination of a bunch of elements that are popular right now. It sort of has that J.J. Abrams, who's just an executive producer. It's from Eric Kripke, who created Supernatural, and that's a really fun show. But it has a lot of really like sort of zeitgeisty elements, things that are out there right now, and they're combined in sort of a calculating way to my mind. But I can see where people would watch it and be like, yeah, I'm really into this. There's a girl with a bow and arrow, you know.
It definitely feels engineered to me. I mean, it has Giancarlo Esposito as the representative of this repressive government, so everybody who loved him as Gus Fring on Breaking Bad can sort of be, oh, it's exciting, he's still working even though Gus got blown up. It has the sort of veneer of a serious issue. It's, you know, a post-apocalyptic society where the lights have gone out, electricity doesn't work except for in an African-American lady's basement where apparently it does. It's a show that to me seems to have the problem that a fair number of network dramas do, is that the older, sort of more well-defined characters are the most interesting people in the show, but the main characters are these extremely pretty, bland people. It's like the CW does the casting for everybody's network dramas, and maybe I'm overstating and complaining, but that seemed like a real problem with the show to me. I don't care about either of these pretty young things who are wielding the appropriately badass weapons. And I'm much more interested in hanging out with Zach Oath's former Google executive who's trying to figure out what his purpose is in a world without the internet, much less electricity.
Are you saying that you were more interested in Terry O'Quinn and Vanessa Williams than the two really uninteresting rich white people leads, pretty white people leads in 666 Park Avenue?
Yes. I mean, I'm sorry, but Terry O'Quinn and Vanessa Williams as either the devil and his wife or, you know, two aspects of the devil, that's a really interesting show. I don't really care about the people who they're going to seduce, who should be their sort of, you know, Fausts of the week.
Yeah. Yeah, I would watch Faust of the Week. That would entertain me. No, there is really that problem that they just sort of have these bland, the people who are supposed to be everymen in the center of these shows. And you look at drama, and it's driven by really distinctive personalities.
Right.
if I'm thinking about a show that sort of worked with kind of bland people at the center, it was Lost. And honestly,
Right.
by the end of that show, the main character, they really dug into how he was a self-righteous douchebag. So that doesn't even really apply there. At the start, it was sort of true, but by the end, it wasn't.
Yeah.
So it's such a weird thing to me because I don't look at these shows and I don't see anybody with the charisma or the talent of a Matthew Fox who's going to force everybody to write him in a different way. It really feels like one of the biggest problems with television, network television right now, is that the networks are terrified that there won't be relatability, but at the same time they are completely uncertain of what is relatable to the general American public because their veneer of relatability, and I've talked about this with many showrunners, especially in comedy, that the network executive idea of relatability is, you live in at the very least, you live in like a planned community. And there are people who live in planned communities, but it's a very, very small portion of the population. It's remarkably hard to get a show about even middle-class people on the air now. You look at all of these shows, and they're not people... You look at some of the greatest comedies ever made, and you're looking at things like The Honeymooners or All in the Family or Roseanne or even Malcolm in the Middle was really a strong show about this family that struggled to get by. And it's just, we've got The Middle and Raising Hope right now, and they're both very good shows. They're both terrific shows. But, that everything else is about this sort of bland world where there's no such thing as class or race or anything. It's just sort of this bland, homogenized world where everybody, laughs at dirty jokes.
Yeah, it can get a little bit depressing. That's a good point.
And I think that was the promise of Two Broke Girls. That's why I think a lot of us, myself included, wanted that show to be better than it was, which is, it had two really strong leads, and it had a really interesting world to explore, and it was explicitly about, like, financial issues, at least for its first 10 episodes or so. And then, it became a big hit, and they were like, well, we got to do more stuff with the horse, because there was a horse, and people like that, so... Yeah,
there's a horse and a short Asian man whose penis we can make jokes about, basically.
Yeah, and I could appreciate that they were trying to do like a broad-based sitcom that also had some reality to it, but the reality went out the window as soon as they became a hit. They said, we're just going to do a show where there's a horse that lives in the backyard, and that's fine. We parted ways at that decision.
Fair enough. That's actually a good point to pilot to a couple of places where I think more interesting programming decisions are taking place, and that is Hulu and Netflix and the stations they are increasingly in competition with, which are some of the cable networks which are building their own portals for streaming video content. And one of the things that I think both of us found really interesting at TCA was John Landgraf, the president of FX, who really just bluntly took on Netflix and the idea that its programs are, watched or getting cultural traction. And, Netflix has swiped pretty hard at FX in a number of its earnings reports, saying that despite the fact that FX has this big library of movie content and, a pretty well-watched stable of original programming, that FX would never be able to build a competitive sort of streaming video portal. And it was a panel that I think made both of us think a little bit differently about who some of these networks and these streaming services are competing with. That seemed to be your impression as well.
Well, I think you undersell how bizarre this was, that, like, he just launched into this thing against Netflix. It came literally out of nowhere. Nobody was expecting him to go up there and start talking about how Netflix is, they need to start reporting more accurate ratings numbers. It's essentially, I don't know, it's like the equivalent of, because in the TV Critic, especially in sort of the establishment TV Critic eye, stuff like Netflix, Hulu, Yahoo, YouTube, they're aware of it, but it's a blip. To us, I think we're a little more aware of it because we work on the internet where our readerships are really engaged with this sort of world. But to a lot of the people who write television journalism and criticism, this is a blip compared to who the new Dancing with the Stars cast is. But so John Landgraf goes up there and launches into this thing, and for those people, I just imagine it was like if Barack Obama opened a press conference by talking about how Canada needed to give better numbers for its I don't know what Canada doesn't have. Yeah. If Canada had to give better numbers for its film industry or something.
Sure.
But it really was a bizarre thing. But yeah, it made me sort of. Everybody's waiting to see how things are going to shuffle out. Well, they don't want to abandon the old model, which seems to frustrate everybody on the internet. Which seems to frustrate everybody on Twitter, which is a percentage of the American population. They don't want to abandon the old model, but they also are sort of jockeying to see who's going to be ahead in the new model. And to my mind, the one site that's really sort of nailing down what they want to be is Hulu. Netflix maybe, but at the same time they're throwing all this money into some very expensive projects, and if those projects don't work, what's their backup plan? I mean, you look at HBO.
It's nice to spend $100 million. Yeah, it's nice to spend $100 million on a remake of House of Cards, a British series that nobody thinks needs to be remade, with David Fincher, who's sort of notoriously difficult, but. Yeah, that's what, 20% of the $500 million that Hulu is spending on content overall, and they're getting a much greater variety of things for the money that they're spending.
And Hulu's always going to be driven by Family Guy reruns and people wanting to check out the clips from the last Daily Show. And that's fine. That's great. I'd like to check out the clips from the last Daily Show on Hulu. But I really think they're picking up some adventurous stuff. They're doing some original programming. And they're doing stuff in, from other countries. Like one of my favorite shows of the year, which is the British series Rev, which I talk about everywhere now. So I'm going to start talking about it here. But it's a show about a pastor in inner city London, and he sort of deals with the issues and times of and the issues of his day, but also it's funny. It's a comedy,
yes,
and it's got a great ensemble, and I'm sort of blown away that something this small and unassuming and gentle was made anywhere in the world, and I'm just so pleased to watch it every week. But I really feel like Hulu is where Netflix is saying, we're going to spend all this money on two series, basically. They're spending a lot of money on Arrested Development, and they're spending a lot of money on House of Cards. But, maybe people will come for Arrested Development. I wouldn't be surprised. But at the same time, I feel like if you look at the cable channels that really broke through, your HBOs and your FXs and your AMCs, they started with cost-conscious programming. And then over time, they, built into a place where, AMC spending all this money on The Walking Dead and HBO spending all this money on Game of Thrones. And, they built to that place. It feels like Netflix is starting at the place where it wants to compete with HBO, but doesn't, it doesn't have a plan B. Like, if nobody watches if nobody watches their new programming, what are they going to do, Hulu is just going to keep throwing stuff at the wall because they're making deals for fairly small stuff, and sometimes stuff catches on. We talked with some Hulu executives, and apparently some of their original content does very well for them. And I wouldn't have predicted that, but they make it for a song, and if it takes off, then a lot of that's going to be profit. And I don't see what the upside is for Netflix. But I've been wondering about Netflix's business strategy for quite a while, and they seem to sort of be They seem to sort of be on autopilot and just going forward with no problems. So I may be completely misreading the situation.
Well, Hulu seems to work on a lot of levels, right? I mean, they have a subscription service that also has some ad support and Hulu Plus, and then it has its free ad-supported program. and its ads are very targeted. Netflix doesn't have ads at all.
No.
So it has those sort of multiple business models. And then it also has sort of these multiple strategies and revenue streams. If its original programming experiment doesn't work out, it can go back to just being the portal by which, the major non-cable networks get their shows to a new audience. And that, appears to be fairly important to some of them. The CW, which is having a lot of trouble, is, I think relying very heavily on both, sort of social coverage and social buzz around its shows and people watching programming through Hulu and, other portals. So it seems to me like that is a business model that, it's trying a bunch of things. It's syndicating kinds of original content like Rev or like the Israeli series Prisoners of War, on which Homeland is based, that, other networks kind of haven't been able to take care of or find a way to make work. So it's identified a bunch of little niches, and whether they work together as an overall business, I think remains an open question, but I think a number of them on their own could be just totally viable businesses. And so, I think that Hulu is sort of, Netflix gets a lot of the coverage that Hulu should be getting, in other words. I think Hulu is just much more potentially disruptive, actually, than Netflix is.
Well, nobody knows what Hulu is. It's like, it's not YouTube, but it's also not Netflix. And it's also not, a cable channel. It combines elements of all of them without being dominant in any one of them, I guess I would say. That is, I think it's an interesting blend of elements they've put together over at Hulu. I get like really excited. I'm a Hulu Plus member. Blatant plug. I'm a Hulu Plus member, and I go to the site, and they have just a wide variety of content, and I'm just always impressed by like all the weird stuff I can watch. To me,
and they've got a lot of good historical stuff too. I've been rewatching the Mary Tyler Moore Show through it.
Yeah.
It's all of this little stuff that I may have not originally thought that I wanted, but it's broadening my TV viewing experience, and for not very much money. Yeah. And, when I look at the fact that BBC America appears to go on and off my cable subscription all the time, it's nice to know that I'm going to get these episodes of Rev, or that I'm going to get the new season of The Thick of It and Misfits syndicated to me through this reliable channel. It's, it feels both more cost-effective and more targeted than cable does in certain ways. And, I think that is if an online sort of disruptive service feels more, reliable to me than my cable does, that says something.
Yeah. And also the persistent question with Hulu is funding. The persistent question with them is that, they're owned by all of these networks, and that's not a tenable situation long term. The networks have tried to sell them off. Google looked at buying them a couple years back, but nobody's ever wanted to really buy Hulu. I think because everybody understands that like negotiating those deals with the networks to rebroadcast that content is going to become exponentially more difficult if it's owned by a third-party company.
Right.
But with the networks having controlling stakes in it, it's sort of this situation where, they have and that's part of the frustration of Hulu is that Fox puts stuff on at different times from NBC, and ABC puts stuff on at different times from the CW, and it's all very confusing. But I think Hulu has made its uncertainty about like where its next paycheck is coming from essentially into a strength. In that they just sort of try and get everything. They try and have a giant smorgasbord of stuff you can watch. And to be sure, that also exists on Netflix streaming. But I feel like Hulu is a little better about knowing what it wants to have and also sort of directing you in the direction of the stuff that you want to watch. Like, I don't know. My wife and I have a Netflix account and a Hulu account, and I feel like Hulu is much better about sort of, you liked this, well, you're going to like this. And I know that Netflix has gotten a lot of praise for its algorithms, but for me, they've always been a little wonky. And that may just be me.
Yeah. It's an interesting question, especially because I think to a certain extent, Landgraf is right. We don't actually know very much about these business models or how they work.
Yeah.
And it makes it, Andy Forssell, who's the sort of development executive at Hulu, is very upfront with both of us that he has no intention of giving us his numbers because he doesn't need to. His clients are effectively his advertisers. And if they're happy, then, telling us the rest of us what works and what doesn't actually matter very much.
Yeah. And the big advantage of Hulu, or I guess if Netflix ever adds ads, is that they know so much demographic information about who watches what that, if I'm, big shoe company and I want to target 18 to 24-year-old guys who play a lot of sports, Hulu can do that. And there are companies that will pay a premium to specifically target that demographic.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's going to be a really interesting atmosphere, and I also wonder, part of the reason that Netflix investment in a sort of cable business model has sort of struck me as a little bit dubious is that someplace like Netflix can produce, something like Prisoners of War. It costs $200,000 an episode to make. FX is, putting some pressure on other shows with something like Louie, which has, a $250,000 budget per episode. And so starting with the most expensive stuff both seems dubious as an investment strategy because you get a narrower range of content, and it also just means that you're starting at a place that the industry seems to be at least trying to move away from.
I think it's sort of an exciting time. This is such a cliche, but I think it's an exciting time to be sort of watching this business. I don't cover it extensively, but I like knowing the ins and outs of it. I will be very interested to see where everything is in 20 years, because I think it's going to look nothing like what it looks like right now.
Well, hopefully both of us will still be, sending our robot bodies off to TCA to cover it for us.
Oh, yeah. Well, in 20 years, nanotechnology will have given us all eagle wings, and it'll be awesome.
We'll need more space in the ballroom.
Yes.
I wanted to close out today. We've been talking a lot about sort of television business, but not a lot about television itself. And I wanted to talk about, I think, one of the shows that both of us are very engrossed in right now, which is Breaking Bad. And it's been really interesting for me seeing the debate this season, particularly around the character of Skyler White, the sort of long-suffering and sometimes nagging wife of meth cook Walter White, who is kind of thrown down with her husband. And it seems to have opened up a real chasm between people who find Skyler sort of interesting and sympathetic, and people who think she is a, scheming, crazy, emasculating bitch.
Yes.
And it's been interesting to watch.
Yeah.
I'll put it that way.
I like Skyler. I will come out and say that. I think she's a fun character. I think she's a fascinating character. I think she's interesting to sort of try and parse. I have not seen this week's episode yet. I don't know if you have. I have not seen I've seen the one that just aired, the one with the train heist, but I haven't had a chance to watch the upcoming one. But recently, my wife and I went back and watched some of the earliest episodes of the show. Where the Skyler hate really took hold, and I just don't see it. I don't see it. I mean, I can see places where she makes terrible decisions. I can see places where she's mean to Walt. I can see places where Walt's mean to her. I just don't see this sort of prevailing opinion that she was this crazy, emasculating shrew who, kept him down. And as soon as he started gaining his power, and this is a really prevalent argument on the internet, sadly, as soon as he started gaining power, she tried to keep him down again, and now she's just frustrated because she's not in power anymore. And I don't want to discount it. I think it's a terrible argument, but I don't want to discount it out of hand, because I think that there is, I don't want to say there's truth to the argument that Walt was emasculated, but I think there is truth to the argument that when the show began, they were in a terrible marriage, and they sort of kept each other in positions where neither of them were terribly happy, but they were just comfortable enough to not come out and say, I'm unhappy. And of course, his cancer diagnosis sort of threw a spanner in the works, so to speak. So yeah, I think that when the show began, they were in an unhappy marriage, but I don't think it was, this weird power struggle that she was attempting to win. Any more than any marriage is a weird power struggle. Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that struck me as sort of interesting about Breaking Bad, and about this debate in particular, is that it illustrates a problem that I think anti-hero shows, which are the sort of dominant form of our prestige television, have, which is that they set up these people who are doing bad things, or in some cases are outright bad people, and kind of lure us into sympathizing with them, and then kind of question our moral flexibility. And I think that the idea that Skyler is sort of this emasculating, horrible person illustrates the fact that a lot of people get the first half of the equation. They get super invested in watching Walt be awesome and cook meth, but they're not very interested in the second half of the equation, which is the moral reckoning. And, I think some of that is fueled by something like The Sopranos, which ends on this ambiguous note, as opposed to, something like The Shield, which ends on this much, sort of blunter confrontation with Vic Mackey's misdeeds and sort of the corruption of his character. But I think that, it's a problem for this big moral art form that people really don't like the moral bit.
Yeah. It's a really common, and the most famous one is sort of on Dexter. The fans really, really hated Rita, his girlfriend and later wife, and I never quite understood that. And a big part of it is you want to see the protagonist push the story forward, and a lot of the time the wife or girlfriend who acts, like any normal human being would act, and, ask, why is my husband/boyfriend acting so crazy, that becomes an obstacle within the fiction of the show. And so on that level, I can sort of understand it, even if I think it frequently turns the corner into being very upsetting and creepy. But I always sort of ask myself, if there was a show with a female anti-hero, would people hate the boyfriend or the husband who held the female anti-hero back? And I think I finally have an example. I think that people do, to an extent, because I really feel like Girls, the Lena Dunham created series, has a female anti-hero as its lead, essentially. But one who's sympathetic, like, Walter White and Tony Soprano and Vic Mackey are sympathetic in many ways. And people really did hate her boyfriend. For a lot of reasons, and a lot of good reasons, and a lot of weird reasons in some cases, but people really did see him as an impediment to her happiness. And I think some of this is just a human reaction to wanting to see the protagonist succeed and wanting to see the protagonist be happy. The problem comes when it's this weird strain of like misogyny or really, really angry attitudes towards women creeps in there, and that's obviously a problem. But I don't want to paint all people with that same brush, which happens a lot, I think. But also, part of it is that there are some people who legitimately think that Skyler should be, kicking ass and taking names, which I would find really unbelievable if she suddenly was, but I guess that point of view sort of makes sense to me as well. So I think that the problem is not that we need people to treat the wives of our male anti-heroes better. I think the problem is that we need more female anti-heroes.
Yeah, and that was sort of what I was going to say to you about Girls, because, Hannah Hobarth is an anti-hero. She is, someone we feel sort of uncomfortable about liking, but I don't think anyone really thinks she's awesome. I mean, a lot of people, the character's been criticized as sort of selfish and self-absorbed and myopic. And so it's a slightly different dynamic than people who want to see Walt blow someone else up with a nifty combination of chemicals. And, the shows that we've had that are about female anti-heroes who are active as opposed to passive haven't actually done that well. I mean, the biggest example of them is Damages, which is airing its final season right now. And, that's a show where Glenn Close is, evil and conniving, does bad things in the name of theoretically good causes. And, people just didn't seem to have liked it that much. And maybe that's a problem with the execution of that specific show, but people haven't tried that often.
The people who liked Damages, the people who watched Damages, and I'm not a big Damages fan, but I've seen a surprising amount of it. But the people who liked and watched Damages were not into Glenn Close's family life. They in general find that part of the story very boring. They want to see her screwing people over in the courtroom, not or plotting weird Byzantine murders. They don't want to see her dealing with whatever her kid's up to. And I think I think that's just this thing is that there's this real strain, especially in like internet television discussion, that wants everything to be more awesome all of the time. But television writers know they know if it's 100% awesome all of the time, then eventually nothing is awesome. So they need to balance that out with these sort of smaller domestic tales. But when you look back at like Breaking Bad, and you look back at the moments you remember, it's rarely like a really strong, until this season I would say, it's rarely a really strong fight between Walt and Skyler. It's, Hank gunning down the cousins, or Walter throwing down his chemicals and making a bomb, or, the showdown with Tuco or the showdown with Gus. You don't remember his big fights with Skyler. And I think what this season has been very canny about is that it's essentially shifted Skyler into the role of Gus, and has forced, last season a lot of people really cheered for Gus Fring over Walter White, because Walter had become sort of a horrible, Walter had really given into his dark side, so to speak. And this season they've sort of slotted Skyler into that Gus role, where, her hands aren't clean, she's done bad things, but you see where she would be a much better, having sort of this empire than her husband would. And the show is sort of cannily playing these things against each other.
Well, that sort of leads me towards maybe a good place to wrap up, and thank you for giving me so much of your time, because Breaking Bad began in, its final season with a combination of sort of domestic and awesome images. On the domestic side, it's Walt, celebrating his birthday alone with bacon and eggs at a diner. And on the awesome side, it's a crazy gun in the trunk of a crazy car. So where do you, and this for me changes week to week, how do we think this show is going to end? This strange hybrid of domestic drama and meth-selling badassness in the Arizona desert.
I've been very impressed, outside of this train heist episode, I've been very impressed with how they've gotten back to the domestic drama roots of the show. Season 4 is a good season of TV. It's not my favorite season of the show. It's pulpy, but it's pulpy in a way that I find sort of obscures that they were stalling the plot in a lot of ways. It's awesomely pulpy. It's awesome and fun, but if you sit there and sort of think about it for a while, it sort of falls apart. Not in a way that ultimately hurts it, but in ways that sort of take it down from the level of seasons 2 and 3 to me. But they've really downshifted into telling stories about who these people are at their core and how they relate to each other. And that, to me, is always the most interesting thing about the show. I love watching a really heartfelt conversation between Walter and Jesse, in which Walter is trying to manipulate Jesse. I love watching Skyler and Walter fight and having Skyler get the upper hand over him, and having him try and come back against it, and having her, just have basically, she doesn't care anymore. She doesn't care. That's the stuff I've always really responded to in the show, and I'm glad that they're sort of going back to those domestic drama roots. Because I imagine it's going to turn pulpy here real soon, and that's fun, and I love it when the show does that. But I think it's best when it's backed up with a real strong character basis.
Well, I think for me, both sort of in the context of the show's morality and in terms of the engagement with the viewers, I would really like Walt to just finally be forced to see himself clearly, not as Heisenberg, not as this, perfect father who's being unjustly accused by his wife, but, as someone who has become this petty, nasty little tyrant whose kingdom is blue meth and a ranch house in Arizona. And I feel like that would be much more devastating than seeing him go down in a hail of bullets. But I'm not sure that big gun augurs well for my wishes. We'll have to see.
My favorite fan theory is that he's going to be caught, he's going to go to jail, and he's going to have to live with basically what his soul has become for the rest of his life. Like he's going to be sitting in a jail cell living with this sort of dark version of himself that he self-created. And I like that theory. I still think that Vince Gilligan is a little too interested in like old school morality play. I think it's going to end bloody for Walt, but I like that idea that he's going to be trapped with this terrible version of himself that he created.
And with no one, because he's always wanted people to affirm it, but to finally have to live with himself and have everyone reject him. That seems like it would be fitting. Well, Todd, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and it's a treat to have you on the show.
Oh, it was great being here.